welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. As U.S. President-elect Donald Trump decides on who will hold key positions in his new administration, there is global anxiety over what he will do in Ukraine. We're talking in this week's episode of the World Deciphered with retired General Phil Breedlove, who served as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and warns that giving Putin what he wants, allowing him to keep the land he now holds without any substantive security guarantees for Ukraine, would be a win for Moscow, with reverberations felt around the world. But first, why does a Silicon Valley entrepreneur think the U.S. is in the midst of a national security crisis, a crisis that he says the Pentagon is not prepared for? In this week's State Secrets podcast, I'm talking with Silicon Valley entrepreneur and Stanford professor Steve Blank about why he says if you don't know that the U.S. is in a national security crisis, you're not paying attention. You can listen to the State Secrets podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, let's check in now with the Cipher Brief's managing editor, Tom Nagorski, to find out what's been leading the website at thecipherbrief.com and the top stories this week. Tom?
Well, Suzanne, obviously a big focus for us this week has been the global reaction to Trump's victory, which ranged, as we've said on the site, from jubilation in some quarters to high anxiety in others. One leader clearly pleased with the result is Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, who figures his friendship with Trump and Trump's pro-Israel views will give him an even freer hand than he's already had in the wars against Hamas and Hezbollah. Netanyahu called Trump's win history's greatest comeback. As for anxiety, that's probably being felt most acutely in Ukraine for two basic reasons. They've heard Trump repeatedly criticize U.S. military aid for Ukraine. They've also heard his promises to end the war in 24 hours, which they worry would mean surrendering territory to Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky was clearly trying this week to put the best face on all this. He congratulated Trump. He spoke to him. He said it was a productive conversation. But then Zelensky also stressed the need for, quote, a fair ending for the war, not a quick ending. As for Vladimir Putin, he called Trump, quote, courageous and manly. That's a very Putin-style compliment. He also said Trump's plans for ending the war deserved attention. Other news this week, back to Israel, where Prime Minister Netanyahu faces a new political storm after he fired his defense minister. Millions of Israelis had felt that Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, was a check on some of Netanyahu's harsher policies, and there have been huge protests as a result. That's something to watch. Another thing to watch, back to Ukraine, we're hearing early word of a Russian counteroffensive underway in the Kursk region of Russia. And you'll remember that's where Ukraine conducted a lightning raid this summer, capturing hundreds of square miles of Russian territory. And as we said here last week, that is where you'll find some of those thousands of North Korean troops, the first regiment of foreign fighters involved in the war. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Tom. You can find more on all the stories Tom just talked about, once again, at thecipherbrief.com, as well as expert insight into what it means. All right, as Tom mentioned, there is plenty of anxiety to go around when it comes to Ukraine and what the incoming president is going to do to help end the war there. You probably remember that on the campaign trail, President-elect Trump said he would now end the 2.5-year war, possibly before he even took office. What he didn't say on the campaign trail was how he would do it. That's causing anxiety not only in Kyiv, but also in places like Georgia, Bulgaria, Moldova, a region heavily targeted by Russian influence operations, and in some cases like Georgia, where Russian troops are still occupying territory. We spoke this week with retired General Phil Breedlove about that and about how a wrong move in Ukraine by the U.S. could impact Russian operations around the world for years to come. General Phil Breedlove, welcome to the Cipher Brief. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me back. I look forward to our conversation.
I think the top question on everyone's mind after President-elect Trump now secured sort of his victory in the U.S. election is what's going to happen in Ukraine. And I know that no one has that crystal ball to be able to tell us, but I'm wondering, what do you see as the scenarios? He promised on the campaign trail this was going to be a quick end to this war. What are the options here, like good and bad?
So it is an amazing concern or just thought process for many on both sides of the aisle about how he's going to handle this. And before I get to your answer more specifically, if I could, I'd like to remind people about his first time as president. Leading up to his term, and during his election, there were a lot of pretty tough words, tough love for NATO. You remember the time.
I do.
And he was pretty tough on NATO when he got started. And he started holding people accountable to promises that they had made. Now, I was fairly open-minded and open in my thoughts about his tactics, his techniques, and his procedures, as we say, TTPs. But no one can argue with the results of what he did. He was the first president in 4 decades that got NATO to increase their spending. And look at them now. They're, I think, around 23 or 24 of the nations are meeting their goals and so forth. So it was tough. But he got some results. And may I also point out the facts that very few people understand is during his time, our troop presence in Europe increased. Our investment in European infrastructure increased. And our participation in large-scale exercises increased. So for all of the tough language, in essence, during his first presidency, NATO benefited. So I think that as we approach now your real question, and what about now, we have to understand that the tools that President-elect Trump, will be using to try to move the scale a little bit in NATO. He has been very open and vocal about ending wars. And we all agree that's a noble concept. I support that concept. The manner in which you end a war is important. And his words are, I'm going to end that in a day. I'm not sure that'll happen, but I think he does have a purpose to end it quickly. But end it is the key phrase. What does that mean? And people forget right now that Mr. Putin desperately needs a pause. He desperately needs a ceasefire. His army has been mauled. He's losing people. The high numbers now are approaching 1 million men. The real reputable figures are a minimum of 650,000 casualties, maybe 220,000 dead, and the rest so severely injured they'll never fight again. And so Mr. Putin needs a pause. That's not going to be a concession for Mr. Putin. He's going to act like it is, but he desperately needs to refit and refurbish his army. Look, he's paying North Koreans to come and liberate Russian territory. Let's go over that one more time. Russia is in such a bad manpower place that he is getting North Koreans to come liberate Russian territory. And so when we begin this negotiation for what might happen next, I think we need to keep focused on what Ukraine sees as their path ahead and how we best get them to that path ahead. And if we are going to capitulate and give Mr. Putin everything he wants, all the land he owns now, a ceasefire so that he can get his broken army fixed. If we give him everything he wants, that's not going to be good. And if I could just close, Suzanne, with one more thought. And these are Phil Breedlove's opinions, but I think they're shared by an awful lot of people. In 2008, Russia amassed its army, marched across an international border, invaded and occupied portions of Georgia. They still occupy 20% of Georgia.
That's right.
The West rewarded Putin's bad behavior by allowing him to do that. In 2014, Mr. Putin amassed his army, went across an internationally recognized border, and occupied Crimea and portions of the Donbass. The West's response was inadequate again, and we rewarded Mr. Putin's bad behavior by allowing him to hold 12 to 13% of the most important commercial land in Ukraine. Now here we are in 2024. What I do not believe we can afford to do is once again reward Mr. Putin's bad behavior. I've raised 3 children. I'm in the middle of raising 3.5 grandchildren. And I will tell you that what I have learned in my life is you reward bad behavior, you reward bad behavior, and you reward bad behavior. You are not going to get good behavior next.
Yeah.
So I think we need to, in the ending of this war in Ukraine, we have to make Mr. Putin pay a price.
Yeah.
If we give him everything he asks for, we're just setting him up for the next episode.
Let me ask you, the Cipher Brief was in Kyiv twice this year, and both times there were whispers, I'll still say at this point, of potentially giving up some of the land as a way to end this war. So it's not like it's the first time that they've been thinking about this topic in Kyiv. My question to you is, one of the things that they've been very insistent on, and President Zelensky has been pushing for, is NATO membership. But that also seems to be a red line for Mr. Putin. So what kind of security guarantees or assurances would Ukraine need to walk away from in order for this not to be a complete win for Mr. Putin?
So sadly, we have a poor track record here. Let's remember the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Where Ukraine agreed to de-arm itself specifically of nuclear weapons, but take other military actions as well. And in that memorandum, 4 countries entered into an agreement that assured Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Those 4 nations were Ukraine, of course, Russia, the United States, and Great Britain, the United Kingdom. So we assured Ukraine of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. You now get to be the professor. Grade our paper. How have we performed on our promises, our assurances in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum?
Yeah, Kyiv would say not well.
F minus at the very best, F
That's
minus.
right.
So I think that based on the history of how we have failed to perform or failed to live up to our promises, we're going to have to do something very much more demonstrative, declarative, making an open statement of what our intentions would be and putting them in a treaty with approval by the Senate, which then would cause us to live up to our promises. And something has to happen. That would be an option. The other option, which is the best, is just bring them into NATO. In a sort of West Germany, East Germany sort of model like we had during the Cold War, where Russia was occupying part of Germany and the West was occupying the other part of Germany, we could do that.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, short of some concrete treaty language, that's the best option.
I want to focus a little bit more on NATO, but before we leave Ukraine, one other question that I've been thinking about quite a bit is what happens to all of this incredible military innovation and entrepreneurship? And Ukraine has done in the last 2.5 years amazing things with the technologies that it's been given. People are investing in these young Ukrainian companies now. What happens to all of that, do you think? I mean, there have been conversations about Ukraine becoming the next sort of, leading innovator of battlefield technology in the world.
I don't think they're the next. They are it.
Yeah.
I mean, I have good friends in this industry, obviously, and I'm associated with Georgia Tech and GTRI, the Research Institute, where some of our very best electronic warfare work is being done in our nation. And I challenge them all the time, and sometimes they're not very happy with my challenge. But the bottom line is, who is leading in drone and small drone technology in the world? It's not the United States. It's Ukraine. And then possibly right behind them, it's Russia. And then right behind them, it's maybe Israel. But the bottom line is we're probably not in the top three.
And that's concerning.
Who's leading in electronic warfare, jamming, and other intrusive methods to defeat these kind of things? It's not the United States. Now, here's what I would say. And I do believe the challenge. When I say that occasionally, the United States, the research institutes and things challenge me back saying, you're wrong, General Breedlove. We actually have the best technology and the best research in the world, but we are not fielding it. Mm-hmm. In Ukraine and Russia, they have the immediacy of the battle, and that day it's going on, and they are moving technology to the battlefield far faster than we do in the West. Our acquisition programs are moribund. We just are horribly slow. We shoot ourselves in the feet with how we get technology to the battlefield, and they're doing it way better. So I would accede to those research people who would push back on me. Maybe we do have the best technology and the best research, but let me assure you, we do not get it to the battlefield at the speed that Ukraine and Russia and Israel and other people get it to the battlefield.
Yeah. I want to ask you a quick question on the NATO issue before I move away from that. I want, they have a new Secretary General. They're going to have, for the first time in 10 years, kind of new leadership, new thinking at the top. How do you think that's going to impact the way that NATO sees the challenges ahead of it? And they were listed out, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the new alliance that's formed against them. That's one of the things. Terrorism, which still people aren't talking enough about, is a real challenge for NATO. More aggressive Russia. What do you see changing for NATO and Europe, and in light of either the results of the election or just the state of the world today?
So my prediction is steady as she goes. Mm-hmm. In Europe, remember now that in Europe we have a war going on. Whether people want to agree with that or not, mm-hmm. The enemy gets a vote and there's a war going on because Russia is invading Europe. And now we have an Asian nation aiding in the war, entering in the war against Europe. Remember, Ukraine is Europe. And now we have North Korean Asian forces fighting in Europe against Ukraine. So we have a war widening now to a more global aspect. I wouldn't call it yet a global war, but there are global aspects of this war going on in Ukraine. So I think that NATO is going to keep focused first and foremost on their own backyard. Mm-hmm. I do believe that NATO will take more and more interest in Asia. But I remind people it's not new. My fourth day on the job at NATO as the SACEUR, I signed a paper that acknowledged and sort of tacitly approved. We had 8 European countries, 8 NATO countries who were sailing forces in RIMPAC. Are you familiar with RIMPAC?
I'm not as much as you are, I can promise you that.
RIMPAC is the largest naval exercise in the Asia-Pacific region, and it used to happen on an every 2-year basis. It occasionally happens more frequently now, but RIMPAC is a massive exercise of all of the rim of the Pacific nations. And we had NATO forces going there all the time. And why is that? Trading nations, great maritime nations, which we still have an awful lot of those in NATO, they need free and open passage of the South China Sea. They need all of these choke points, which are made by these land masses in the Asian Pacific region. It is key that they can sail through them for free commerce and trade. And so there's this sort of revelation that all of a sudden NATO is interested in the Pacific. No, they've been interested in the Pacific for a long time. So I think that NATO's focus will remain primarily on the growing war in Europe.
Yeah.
And the aggressors, which now are not only Russia, but North Korea, and also some not so behind the scenes support from China and so forth. I think NATO will continue to be focused on their backyard.
Let me ask you this question, which I've been dying to ask you because I know it's one of your favorite topics to talk about, and you think quite a bit about it, and it has to do with the U.S. defense industry. There was just a report released a couple of months ago in the United States, a bipartisan report, by the way, that basically said the United States is not currently postured to fight multiple fronts in today's global environment. Do you agree? And what changes do you think need to take place in order for U.S. readiness to be increased and for the U.S. to be ready if it needs to step in? Because the world's not going to become sort of this peaceful, wonderful utopia overnight, regardless of who's president.
So this is a long answer, and I may need you to remind me of a couple of things as we work through it. But my basic answer is no, I don't think we're ready. Part of it is, remember that Putin has his economy on a wartime basis. Mm-hmm. We in America do not. We are on a peacetime basis in America. North Korea has been permanently on a wartime basis and is now supporting Russia with that wartime production basis. And we know, again, not so openly, but we understand that there are things happening where China is supporting the effort in a very quiet way, but supporting with some important technology and things. So right now, there are multiple entities from Iran all the way through to China in the other side of the equation that are very much approaching this in a wartime way. And their production has geared up. In America, we're not there. We are definitely not there. And it will take change from the top down to get us there. Mm-hmm. Industry is not just going to all of a sudden on their own nickel take huge risk with their shareholders' money and start doing things that there is no indication that our government is going to support. And so there's going to have to be some emphasis or policy change in the U.S. System for America to truly begin a wartime support effort. Now, we're not at war. I hear people all the time, we are fighting. The personal pronouns are not correct. We are not fighting. We have done some work defending Israel. Some of our naval and Air Force assets have done some great work helping to defend Israel. Mm-hmm. But we haven't taken the field. We have struck Iranian targets. I call them Iranian targets because we all understand that these proxies are Iran. All their leadership and all their roads and all their supply starts in Iran and it goes back to Iran in the end. So on the fringes, we have done some defending of Israel and some defending of our own people, but we're not fighting. And I think we need to understand that we are not. So it'll take some policy decision to change that, to get us into a state where we're better prepared to supply. Now, let me just attack your larger question a tiny bit. Do we have enough to do all this stuff?
Right.
Yes and no. out of both sides of my mouth. Most people will tell you that in a conventional sense, at the level of effort right now, we have enough of the basic kind of force structure to do what we need to do. What we do not have is we have more names for them now, but we used to call these things low density, high demand, LDHD assets. The AWACS, the carrier battle groups, the bombers, these exquisite forces that bring amazing capability to the battlefield, but they are limited in number. We don't have enough of them to do three things. We have enough of them to maybe do one plus a little somewhere. And so for the larger, more grand forces, we probably are okay right now. Maybe not in the future because our forces are dwindling. The Air Force is smaller and older than it's ever been in its history, including the day it was born. I think it's the same about the Navy. But the bottom line is, what we don't have is those exquisite enablers and capabilities that we would need in every theater where a fight goes. We do not have enough AWACS. We do not have enough ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So we don't have some of these types of assets to go around.
Do you think that will change with the new administration?
Well, Suzanne, let me make one more point because it's very important.
Yeah.
One place we are critically short are precise munitions. The world has changed. We can't go carpet bomb places. Yeah, Iran's doing that. Yeah, Russia's doing that. But the West is not going to allow itself to start carpet bombing like Russia did in Mariupol or Busha or these places. We're not going to be able to do that. We've got to strike with precision, and we have very much diminished our precision supply, our warehouse of weapons that would be needed to go out and fight these fights. So I'm sorry for having interrupted you, but this business of precise weapons is important. I don't want to bring up the specifics because it might cause some consternation in a country that we love a great deal. But in the last decade, three nations went together and did a big precise attack on people that were not conforming with international mores. And in that attack, one of the countries nearly ran itself out of its very best precise weapons. Our magazine is not deep enough to carry on multiple conflicts with the kind of precise weapons we need. Sorry.
So I do think, just going back to the question on that, do you see a change coming there? Because clearly that status quo is not one that's going to be good for the U.S. moving forward. So do you see a change with new leadership in the White House?
I would hate to predict. We have a president, or a president-elect, who has campaigned on an idea that he believes that strength through peace, or peace through strength, peace through strength. In order to have peace through strength, you need two things. You need capabilities and you need credibility. Right now, we're hurting on the credibility part. We have backed up and backed up. As I said, in 2008, we backed up. In 2014, we backed up. Now it looks like in 2024, we're going to back up again. So we're struggling on the credibility piece. The capability piece, as I described before, we have a lot of capability to deliver, but our magazine doesn't support that capability, so we have work to do. In selected areas where we have given a lot to Ukraine, we are gearing up to replace that. It's part of the dynamic. People think we're giving Ukraine money. We really aren't. What we're doing is giving U.S. companies money to build kit that replaces things that we give to Ukraine. My favorite example of that is the first 120 plus ATACMS we gave to Ukraine were ATACMS that we were about to pay a lot of money to demilitarize, because they had reached their service line. We avoided having to pay for that because we gave them all to Ukraine and they shot them to great effect on the battlefield. And now we are replacing those older ATACMS that we were going to get rid of anyway with newer ones. And so we have selected areas where we are investing now in precise weapons. But I would offer to you, we are not anywhere near a wartime production level.
Phil Breedlove, any kind of closing thoughts, anything that we didn't talk about that is really concerning you at this point in time?
Well, I think that what is clear is the world is not going to be a kinder, gentler place into the future. People ask me all the time, what's our policy about Taiwan? What's our policy about North Korea? What's our policy about Iran? We do have those policies. You can go Google them, and they're relatively straightforward. But what my mother told me when I was young, and I'm pretty sure your mother told you when you were young, people aren't going to pay an awful lot of attention to what you say. They're going to pay a lot of attention to what you do. Mm-hmm. So when people ask me what's our policy on Taiwan, I say it's being written in Ukraine right now. Mm-hmm. What's our policy on North Korea? It's being written in Ukraine right now. The world is watching what we do. Are we a reliable ally or partner? And are we going to stand for something? And our policies are all being written right now in Ukraine. Yeah. And I think that we have to approach the world understanding that, just like Mom said, people don't care what you say. They really care about what you do.
Excellent insights there. General Phil Breedlove, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Probably one of the coolest titles I think anyone could have. It's always good to see you. Thank you so much for your time.
Great to see you, Suzanne.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at decipherbrief.com.
A number of Cipher Brief experts weighed in this week at decipherbrief.com with their own expert-level advice as the new president-elect pulls together his new administration. The insights come from former senior-ranking members of the U.S. military and intelligence communities. You can find out what they have to say at decipherbrief.com. And that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. Remember, you can find a lot more interviews with experts at decipherbrief.com's YouTube channel. Check it out, decipherbrief.com on YouTube. And it wouldn't hurt our feelings while you're there if you actually subscribe to the channel. I also encourage you to stay up to speed on what's happening in the world on a 24-hour basis at decipherbrief.com. That's where you'll find our daily open source report, which a lot of people tell us rivals the President's Daily Brief in terms of its focus and content on global security issues. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thanks for watching. I'll see you here next time on The World Deciphered.